tonight's episode of Sustainable Stow. We've been doing this now, what, 2.5 years, Rick, I think?
I've got to figure that out really
I know,
soon.
I do too. Someone asked me today and I couldn't remember. But anyway, I'm Tina McAndrew. I'm the director of the library, and we have been collaborating with Sustainable Stow for monthly presentations. So this is our December version. As you saw, I hit record because we do get a lot of people who like to watch this at a later date. And I would ask that you keep yourselves muted just because of background noise. Feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat. Rick and I will be looking at that throughout the presentation. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Rick.
Thank you, Tina. And I want to say we've been working on getting this session together. I didn't have to do much work, but our speakers did, and it was like getting on their calendars at the right time, and I'm very glad we were able to do this. Tonight, we're going to hear first from Marie Rudiman, who's a senior risk assessor and toxicologist at EnviroRisk Solutions, and then from Susan Crane, an environmental lawyer. Both live in Stow, and some of their practices take them pretty locally to Stow. They are experts in various aspects of our topic tonight, and they understand our local concerns. Marie has 29 years of experience in the environmental consulting field. Susan has 35 years in hazardous waste law. So we've got two great experts on the topic that we're going to be discussing tonight, PFAS in our immediate neighborhoods, homes, wells, what have you. So I'm going to turn this over to Marie. She's our first speaker. Marie?
All right. All right. Can you see my presentation?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction, Rick. As Rick indicated, my name is Marie Rudiman, and my business is EnviroRisk Solutions. I'm a human health and environmental risk assessor and toxicologist. I'm also a Stow resident for 30 years. And full disclosure, one of my clients is Wilcox and Barton, and we are working on the Stow Center PFAS release, which for the town of Stow. Now let's see if I can get it to move. I can't get it to, oh, there we go. There we go. All right. So what are PFAS? They're commonly called forever chemicals. They are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which are a family of chemicals that have been used since the 1950s to manufacture stain-resistant, water-resistant, and nonstick products. They're very common in consumer products. It's not one compound, but many. EPA actually lists over 14,000 unique PFAS compounds. All of the PFAS compounds are a carbon chain, and each of the carbon has fluorines attached to it. And, you know, the length of the chain can be shorter or longer. The longer chain PFAS are typically more toxic. And attached to that long chain of carbon is a functional group, which is where you can change what PFAS is into different PFAS compounds. They are both water resistant and water soluble. You might ask, how does that happen? It's the very unique chemistry of PFAS, where the carbon and fluorine part is water resistant, and the end unit, the little functional group, is water soluble. So they're quite soluble in water, which is why they're a real problem for drinking water. They bioaccumulate in the body and in organic matter. The more toxic ones have a long half-life of about 5 to 7 years, and they don't typically break down in the environment. So they last, forever once they're in the environment. What contains PFAS? It's estimated that PFAS may be in up to 70% of commercial products. And, when I read that statistics, I'm always like, oh my gosh, how could they possibly be in 70% of commercial products? A lot of the releases that we see into drinking water are related to firefighting foam, also called AFFF. So the other commercial products that we typically see PFAS in are food packaging. That's a big one. It's in food packaging and wrappers. Pesticides, stain-resistant products. It's in microwave popcorn bags. Eye makeup, such as mascara, if you see water-resistant or, water-resistant mascara, that typically has PFAS in it. Pizza boxes, actually a lot of pizza boxes, the formulation has now changed to take out PFAS, and EPA and Massachusetts DEP are working to get regulations in place to get PFAS out of packaging products, food packaging. It's in paints and stains and varnishes. It can be in some cleaning products, nail polish, dental floss, non-stick cookware, water-resistant clothing, and, a lot of athletic gear. Can be in shampoos and even candy wrappers. So this is a pretty complicated little picture here, but I'm going to kind of go over like a couple of pathways that PFAS gets into the environment. So say you buy some athletic wear, right? Some workout gear that has PFAS in it, and a lot of workout wear is considered like stain or water repellent. Those types of clothing typically have PFAS in them. So say you buy some athletic gear, you throw it in their laundry. Fibers from that athletic gear can get into your septic system, and then they leach out of your septic system into the groundwater. And since PFAS does not break down, it'll move through the groundwater, and it may end up in your drinking water or one of your neighbors' drinking water wells. And you draw that groundwater up through your well into your tap, and you drink it. Septic is one of the contributors to PFAS contamination. Firefighting foam in the center of town. Some of the firefighting foam was either used, or when they were draining the hoses, some of the firefighting foam got on the ground, gets into the soil, that leaches down into the groundwater. And again, that groundwater is drawn up through your drinking water well and into your tap. Another common pathway is when you throw that fabric away that has the PFAS in it, it gets into your landfill, that leaches down into the groundwater. Also biosolids, wastewater treatment plants. There's a big one in Massachusetts in the harbor, in Boston Harbor. They were selling biosolid as fertilizer. And we realized a couple years ago that biosolids actually have concentrated PFAS in them. And when you use that for, fertilizer in your farms, it could get into the food. And again, you're ingesting it in the food, and it's getting into your water system. So So what are the effects of PFAS on humans? I found this picture interesting because they had both high certainty and low certainty potential health risks, right? Health effects. The solid lines are the high certainty. So we're pretty sure that PFAS caused those things. And then there's other things that are kind of a lower certainty. So PFAS do cause developmental effects and delayed mammary gland development and lower birth weight in children. If anybody saw the movie The Devil You Know, that actually kind of follows a child of a woman who worked at the DuPont plant in Ohio and kind of detailed his birth defects and his life. Kind of interesting movie in a little bit of a nightmarish kind of way. It had a good ending, but so the developmental effects are certainly one that we're very worried about. At the lower, those are at higher concentrations though. At the lower concentrations that we're seeing in Stow drinking water, you may have like thyroid disease. It does cause hypothyroid disease. PFAS will mimic the thyroid hormones and turns off your body's ability essentially to make the thyroid hormones, causing hypothyroidism. Can cause liver damage and kidney cancer. Those are also at higher concentrations. And then at the very low concentrations, it may cause a reduced response to vaccines. So when we're talking about PFAS in drinking water, the current drinking water standards, there's a maximum contaminant level, we call it an MCL. That's the federal and state standards. So the federal standards from EPA currently are 70 parts per trillion for 2 of the PFAS compounds. So remember I had indicated that there's a whole bunch of different PFAS compounds. Only 2 of them are currently regulated by EPA at the moment. Those are PFAS and PFOA, 2 of the most common PFAS compounds, and they're also 2 of the most toxic PFAS compounds. Massachusetts DEP looked at the federal standards and they said, well, we don't feel they're strong enough, so we're going to reduce that to 20 parts per trillion for the sum of 6 different PFAS compounds. So PFAS and PFOA and 4 others. Now there's new toxicity data for the various PFAS compounds. And so EPA has proposed even lower MCLs, which are supposed to be finalized sometime this month. The concentrations that they proposed for the MCL are 4 parts per trillion for PFAS and PFOA, which are the 2 most common PFAS compounds, and between 9 and 10 parts per trillion for the sum of 4 other PFAS compounds. Now, that's much lower than the 70 that they have now. And that those reduced numbers are based on the endpoint of immunotoxicity. So the reduced response to vaccines. It's unclear if they're going to go that low. It seems as though they're going to adopt between 4 parts per trillion and 10 parts per trillion for PFAS and PFOA, but we won't know until they finalize that sometime this month. So it's unclear what the state values will be, but they can't be less stringent than the federal values. So most states will probably have to adopt the federal numbers when they come out. And then last month, EPA promulgated toxicity values for a total of 30 PFAS compounds. So in addition to the 6 that they are finalizing the MCLs for this month, there are 24 more PFAS compounds which are likely to have drinking water standards in the near future, because when they promulgate those toxicity values, that's kind of the first step. So more and more PFAS compounds are going to be regulated. So how do we understand how toxic PFAS actually is? Well, we can compare to other compounds that we know are pretty toxic and we don't want in our drinking water, right? So the current drinking water standard in Massachusetts is 20 parts per trillion for the sum of 6 PFAS compounds. If we compare that to other compounds like benzene, benzene has a MCL of 5,000 parts per trillion. PCBs has 500 parts per trillion. Chlorinated volatile trichloroethylene, which is a volatile, has 5,000 parts per trillion. 1,4-dioxane has 300 parts per trillion, and dioxins and furans are 30 parts per trillion. So even now, with the current standards, PFAS are considered more toxic than really our most toxic other compounds out there. So if EPA adopts the MCLs of 4 part per trillion for PFAS and PFOA, and 10 part per trillion for some of the other 4, those values will be the lowest of any drinking water standards by far. So I indicated that I work on the release of AFFF in the center of Stow, and I've been looking at Stow's aquifer in general because I live here. So I noticed there were some irregularities. Our team at Wilcox and Barton noticed some irregularities with the PFAS distribution and the types of PFAS in the center of town. And based on fingerprinting, there actually appears to be 2 different releases. One known release, which is the AFFF, and then one unknown release, which we're not sure exactly what it could be. Could be pesticides, could be, who knows. And in the next slide, I'll go into that a little bit more detail. I also noticed that individual properties in Stow have 6, the PFAS 6 concentrations greater than 20 parts per trillion with no known source. So if you look over the whole the whole area of Stow, individual people have had their wells tested, and there's a lot of people out there with over 20, and we just don't know where that comes from. The PFAS may be coming from numerous sources. Pesticide use is one that we know of that could easily be mitigated. And I mentioned that because I did a little bit more research on pesticide use, which I'll talk about in a minute. So when I also do work for the Licensed Site Professional Association. I'm head of the technical practices group right now. And in comments we made to EPA on their new MCLs, we urged EPA not to focus exclusively on setting these very stringent MCLs for these constituents. Attempting to limit the sources of these compounds in products will likely have significantly more public health impact. So what I'm saying here is eliminate the source. And that's actually what I'm talking to you about now. Hopefully we can find some ways to mitigate our exposures. So this is a picture of Stow Center PFAS release. Each of these circles represents a drinking water well. And I will say the town of Stow has provided bottled water and or put people on a point of entry treatment system if you have elevated PFAS in your drinking water well. So exposure to people who have been affected by this release has been mitigated through treatment of their wells, or they're being provided bottled water. But if you take a look at these circles, most of the circles kind of to the north and center and to the west have, they have green and orange. They're mostly green and orange, which is PFAS and PFOA, and that's related to the release of the AFFF. Then you can see more to the south and to the east, a lot of these have more blue in them. That's actually a second release. That's how we kind of fingerprint what's going on with PFAS. That is the unknown release. We're not sure what it is, but it's mostly PFHXS, which is a different type of PFAS. So here's a potential source of PFAS. EPA found PFAS in pesticides, which is related to the fluorination of the high density polyethylene containers. Essentially, the chemical companies will buy the HDPE containers and put them in a fluorinated vessel and post-market fluorinate them, and that creates a container that will have a longer shelf life. And you know, it does, because those HDPE containers can interact with the pesticide inside. Fluorinating them makes the containers last longer. However, it releases PFAS into the pesticide. So EPA detected PFAS at 20,000 to 50,000 parts per trillion in pesticides that were contained in these containers, and 70% of the containers had PFAS detections. So, you know, use of pesticide in the town, we're not sure, you know, if you're in that 30% that are not fluorinated containers, or if you're in the 70% that have the fluorinated containers. Even if you're using an organic pesticide, they can still be in these fluorinated containers, which are fluorinated post-market. They're not marked as fluorinated, but we do know that the chemical companies fluorinate them aftermarket. This is another site that's in Stow that I'm using as an example. Wedgwood Pines Country Club, due to their fertilization and pesticide practices, they have affected the wells of numerous homes in the area. So pesticides and fertilizers that they were using to make those, you know, beautiful, luscious green golf course lawns have impacted the wells of a bunch of homes surrounding Wedgwood Pines. Some of these homes had imminent hazard levels, which is a level of 90 parts per trillion or above. Imminent hazard means right now you stop using that drinking water and go on to bottled water right away. And, you know, Wedgwood Pines Country Club, unfortunately, you know, really due to no fault of their own, is on the hook for mitigation and cleanup at likely lots of money through legal use of pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. This is another project that I've been working on, actually completed it a couple months ago. One of my clients does a lot of field redevelopment. So a lot of environmental advocates out there will indicate, you know, tell the town that they should be testing for certain things before they do any sort of redevelopment. Northborough tested their field for PFAS and found what could be background concentrations of PFAS in the soil, but they were higher than the reportable concentrations for Massachusetts. So once you're above those reportable concentrations, you're in the system. And so I had to evaluate them. Those reportable concentrations for PFAS are protective of leaching into the underlying aquifer. So at this particular site, at this project, DEP recommended that the LSP indicate the concentrations are from pesticide use, which was used, they used properly according to the labels, and you can actually exclude impacts from proper use of pesticides, and then you don't have to evaluate the potential toxicity for that. PFAS at the concentrations detected in soil here, it could be associated with a significant risk using those very low toxicity values that EPA is going to finalize in December, possibly. So those are draft values. We're not sure if they're going to be that low, but under the current toxicity values, these concentrations are considered to pose no significant risk of harm to human health. So also note that when you use pesticides, it's your potential health risks are not only from drinking water, it's from your soil exposures, it's from ingestion of homegrown produce that may be grown in that impacted soil, and it's inhalation of PFAS during spraying activities. So those folks that are actually doing the spraying are getting exposed to PFAS through air. So how do you mitigate your risks of exposure? What can an ordinary person do? So in Stow, we all have drinking water wells, or most of us do anyways. And you can test your drinking water well for PFAS, and then install a point of entry treatment system, a POET system, if the concentrations are above the MCLs or at or above. Used bottled water, that's another potential way to mitigate your exposure if you have it in your drinking water. And then still in development, looking at a new treatment coming out of Cyclopure in Chicago. They have Brita type filters for PFAS. It's a kind of an exciting technology. Another thing that you can do is limit your ingestion of fast food and prepared foods. And I'm going to put in a plug. Please don't eat microwave popcorn. Microwave popcorn has been shown to have one of the higher levels of PFAS, and that's because you're microwaving that popcorn in a container that is coated in PFAS. Actually, when popcorn bags were still made with PFAS, there were a lot of health effects from inhalation, actually. When you open up that popcorn bag and you smell popcorn, you're also smelling the PFAS. Another thing is that I recommend use of integrated pest management instead of broadcast spraying. I see folks with the little signs in the front for the various, Mosquito Joe and other pesticide use. We just don't know how much PFAS is in those, in that pesticide, because it's coming from a fluorinated container, potentially. So instead of using broadcast spraying, personal pesticide use is recommended, and dumping out containers with water and removing open water where mosquitoes breed. Put up a bat house, consider changing out nonstick pans with stainless steel, put it in instead, or cast iron instead. And then recognize consumer products that contain PFAS and ask yourself, do I really need this? I've actually completely changed how I use cosmetics. I don't use mascara anymore. Again, stain resistant clothing. Do I need this? It's in upholstery, it's in furniture. We should be asking our regulators to stop, let's put some regulations in place to get these out of clothing and upholstery and water repellent items. All right, let's go on to Susan. I'm going to stop sharing. And Susan, you're going to have to unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted. I'm trying to, okay, share screen. Okay. Can everyone see this slide and hear me? I think, could some maybe, well.
Yes, we can.
I can hear you. We
Good.
can hear you.
Okay, great, thanks.
All on mute. We're all good.
Before I start, I just want to thank Marie for that excellent presentation and for the education she has given me over the years on toxicology. Yes, Marie is probably the leading toxicologist in Stow, but might also be the leading, or certainly among the very top toxicologists in the state. And it was a real pleasure when we discovered at our mailboxes, which are directly across the street from each other in Harvard Acres, that we're in the same field. That was several years ago, but we've worked together on a number of projects, and I feel really lucky that when I have an issue, even if it's not related to PFAS, but I can just knock on her door or pick up the phone, and she's a couple hundred yards away. So just a little bit of background before I jump into this. Marie gave us a really good overview of what are the problems, what are the issues, how do we address them to make sure our health is protected. I want to focus on the legal issues. What are the legal obligations when PFAS is found, and whose obligations are they to both address mitigation efforts so we're not exposed to PFAS in our homes and schools and places of work, but how this works and what happens if you have PFAS in your well. This was an entirely unregulated field until just a couple of years ago. So the law on this is developing. The focus on human health is developing. A lot of things are changing, and Marie talked about the changing regulations and EPA's new focus on this. We're lucky to be in Massachusetts, where our state Department of Environmental Protection, Mass DEP or DEP, is really ahead of the game and ahead of many states. So let me start by going into my slides. Some of this is a little bit legal, but well, that's my presentation. But I want to start with the very basics. What is a hazardous waste site? This is all governed by Mass General Laws, Chapter 21E. Many of you might have heard the term 21E and associate it with hazardous waste. Chapter 21E defines a hazardous waste site as anywhere hazardous material, which includes PFAS, has come to be located. And that's not necessarily defined by property boundaries. A PFAS site could encompass a small portion of a single property, or it could extend across multiple properties, such as Stow Center and Wedgwood Pines, which have impacted neighborhoods, as Marie mentioned. So a site owner, an owner of a hazardous waste site that is a source of a PFAS release, and I'm going to mention this many times. What is the difference between a source site and a random house where PFAS might be found in groundwater? So source site owners are strictly liable, and that means they are legally responsible without regard to fault. They're liable because they own a property that was a source property. They must conduct environmental response actions, And that's a term of art that means assessment, removal of the contaminants, and eventually a cleanup. And where must they do that? On their own property and any other properties to which PFAS has migrated. That's where it has come to be located, where the PFAS has come to be located. So what happens if PFAS testing finds concentrations of PFAS in groundwater in excess of DEP's numerical standards? Marie just went through the standards with you, but right now in Massachusetts, there are 20 parts per trillion for 6 different PFAS components. Maybe Marie can tell you later, but I seem to remember somewhere that 1 part per billion was a drop in a swimming pool. So multiply that by multiple orders of magnitude and imagine how small a part per trillion is. That tells you how toxic this can be at very, very low levels. So if your property is tested, or anyone's property is tested, and levels of concentrations in groundwater of PFAS are found in excess of those numerical standards, you must notify Mass DEP. So then what? Residential properties that are not part of a larger site are very unlikely to be deemed the responsible party for a hazardous waste site under Chapter 21E. And they're not likely to be given their own what's called release tracking numbers. That's how DEP identifies hazardous waste sites across the state. Before I forget, if any of you want to know more about this, and if you Google DEP and PFAS, you will find a wealth of information on Mass DEP's website. There is also part of Mass DEP's website has, you can look up various sites around the state by category. I just took a look at the Stow sites today, and we have a number of sites, gasoline site spills, fuel oil spills, the PFAS sites that are, or the residential properties that have had PFAS testing where PFAS has been detected in excess of standards. They are not on this site. I'm going to explain that more, but that's really important. So I don't want you to really worry that if you test your well because you're concerned about your family's health and safety, you're suddenly a strictly liable site owner who has to jump through all these hoops to comply with Mass DEP's cleanup regulations. So that leads to the question, who is responsible if PFAS is found on your property? If your property's been impacted by PFAS released from an upgradient source, and I'm referring to groundwater, so that's usually groundwater that's at a higher elevation that flowed through the groundwater to your property, DEP would include your property as part of that site. You wouldn't be your own site. You would be part of the larger site, just like the properties around Stow Center or Wedgwood Pines are part of a bigger site. And that triggers responsibilities of the source owner to address the PFAS on your property under DEP's hazardous waste site cleanup regulations. These regulations, which Marie and I work with every day, they're thousands of pages long, they're complex, they're very progressive in terms of what's going on around the country, and they're very protective of human health. Marie mentioned the term licensed site professional. We refer to them as LSPs. They are the few hundred individuals in the state who are licensed by DEP to clean up hazardous waste sites, to manage them. And they're required at all hazardous waste sites that are official sites in the state. So right now, as I mentioned before, DEP is not assigning site numbers or imposing liability on downgradient owners of non-source properties. How does Mass DEP know if the property where PFAS is found is the source? This can be tricky. Marie even mentioned that there's a known source in Stow Center and there are possible unknown sources. And PFAS is ubiquitous. It could even be in our septic systems and end up in our groundwater through the clothes that we are washing that have PFAS in fire-resistant materials or all sorts of different household products. In fact, in Teflon pans, if we're using them in the sink. We're using them to cook, and then the water obviously is washed down into the septic systems. Sometimes the source can be quite obvious. So when high concentrations are found where firefighting foam was heavily used, such as the Stow Fire Department, that's a pretty obvious source. Some of you may have heard of the huge fire at the Princeton Inn in Princeton, Massachusetts, a few years ago. That was when PFAS was routinely used in firefighting foam, and the runoff water impacted vast neighborhoods. And I regularly get calls about that. A lot of people were impacted. Other examples, Wedgwood Pines, Marie described how that was the result of using pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers on that property, on the golf course, and that was no fault of the owners. They were using legally available products. Manufacturing plants that use PFAS in their operations can be identified as sources. And I want to give you an example of a site I'm working on. This is a manufacturing facility that it turned out after a massive fire, this facility had been using and storing PFAS in its manufacturing operations. This facility was way up on a hill, and many towns' fire departments responded. 1 million gallons of water were sprayed by these various fire departments onto this facility to put out the fire. This was recent enough that newer so-called green firefighting foams were used. And as a result of runoff from the firefighting water, the water ran down the hill, leached into soil and leached into groundwater, and unfortunately impacted a number of private drinking water wells in residents in the neighborhood. So what will the responsible source owner do to make my property, my water safe, if PFAS is found on my property and I can identify the owner? The owner of the source property is required to conduct response actions on your property where PFAS is found in your part of a bigger site to assess the situation, evaluate your groundwater, remove PFAS from your drinking water supply, and that's often a POET system. Marie talked about that, and I saw a couple of comments that came in asking about whether these systems are put on the full water supply of a home. Typically, the answer is yes. So where your well would come into your home, a POET filtration system would be installed to remove PFAS down to the tiny parts per trillion to the drinking water standards. That would have to be tested afterwards to make sure that this system is operating properly, and it has to be maintained with change out of carbon filters after they're spent from the PFAS collection in the carbon filters. Really sadly, as Marie and I have seen, these sites where there's a large plume of contaminated groundwater with PFAS, they cannot be economically, the groundwater itself cannot be economically remediated today down to the tiny parts per trillion. What we're seeing is systems, filtration systems are being put on the water supplies. Public water suppliers are spending millions of dollars to use these huge carbon filters so that when the water leaves the treatment plant, it's safe enough for drinking water. Obviously, with private wells, we don't have that luxury. We have to put those on our own systems. Other forms of remediation that can occur, for example, is if topsoil is contaminated. Marie showed us a slide with a diagram of how aerial deposition can affect, from smokestacks, can affect topsoil. In the situation I gave you of the manufacturing plant on the hillside, the topsoil was actually contaminated by surface runoff. And then the soil itself can be an ongoing source of leachate to groundwater that would continue to contaminate the groundwater. We also don't want people to be exposed to the topsoil. So sometimes the topsoil will be excavated and removed and disposed of off-site at quite an expense to eliminate that ongoing source. So if PFAS is found at unsafe levels in your well, and there is no obvious responsible source that's going to be liable to take care of what's going on your properties, what should you do? In the short term, definitely use bottled water. Don't drink it. That's your main source of exposure from the PFAS in your well. Poets are the current go-to remedial technology, and they would have to be installed on your water system, maintained over the long term. And certainly your water should be tested regularly to make sure that if you have a POET system, it's working properly. So what other impacts might there be if your drinking water supply contains unsafe levels of PFAS? Well, something I always think of in my work is potential diminution in value of your property. That's a reality. If your property is impacted by PFAS, a buyer might not pay the same amount as they would for the same property next door if there's no PFAS in the well. My personal feeling is that as PFAS sadly becomes more of a known issue, more properties are impacted, people understand this, it might not have the same stigma impact when a property is sold. And people might just get used to installing POET systems. In Stow, who doesn't have a water softener? We're used to that because we have iron and manganese at high levels, where that might have been an issue years ago before people understood how to address it. I don't know. But my recommendation and my really strong advice to anybody who has a problem with contamination on their property that hasn't been fully cleaned up, and by that I mean cleaned up so that the groundwater is clean versus a POET system that's cleaning dirty groundwater. In my view, a seller of property must disclose that to a buyer before a sale, or they could later be accused of or even sued for fraud based on the standard, the legal standard, that if you are a seller and you fail to disclose a material fact about your property that can't reasonably be expected to be discovered in an inspection, you might have committed a fraud that could be actionable by the next buyer who says, hey, I paid $800,000 for your house, but it was really worth 500 because of this problem. I'm making up the numbers, so please don't take that to mean that I feel there could be a $300,000 diminution in value. It's just simple math, and those numbers popped into my head. But they could sue you for the difference for $300,000. So here's the final $1 million question. Should I test my well? Well, this was another mailbox discussion between Marie and me, and also both of our husbands. And my husband is an environmental lawyer, and we thought about this long and hard. If we find PFAS that's going to stigmatize our house when we sell it someday, which we all will someday, we're going to have to disclose this. Our houses could be worth less. We both concluded that living in Harvard Acres, there are some properties within our neighborhood that have tested positive for PFAS, and some at levels that really do need to be addressed. I think few in our neighborhood, but there have been some PFAS issues. We decided that our health was much more important, and our family's health, than worrying about resale value, and we were going to test. And both of our houses had non-detect of PFAS. That was one of the nicest ND results I had ever seen on an analytical test, I have to say. And I realize that in this audience, not all of you are so fortunate. So I really feel for those of you who are addressing this now on your own properties. If your property tests clean, your water should be periodically retested because groundwater migrates. On DEP's website, they're recommending testing every 10 years. When I just had my water system in my garage, which treats for a variety of things, including radon, but not PFAS, I asked them, well, how often should I retest for PFAS? And they said, oh, definitely every 2 years. I don't know that that's the protocol. That may be a nice way to make some income on testing. I'm going to leave it to Marie to answer the question about how frequently it should be tested, but I wanted to pass that on anyway. So I really appreciate everybody's interest in this. There are a number of people on this Zoom, I think, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss this with you. And I'm done, and I'm going to stop sharing so we can go on to questions.
I was going to say thank you, Susan, and thank you, Marie. Nice job. And yes, there's a number of comments in the meeting chat. I've seen that Marie, at least, maybe Susan also, has already responded to one of those. And so we'll get to those. We also have a live question right here from Mike. Mike, why don't you ask your question, then we'll go to the chat box.
Great. Well, thank you, Susan and Marie, very much for this presentation. All very helpful. I had a number of questions, but I'll ask just one. If you use a carbon filter in your house, does that not become hazardous waste? And if it does, how difficult and or expensive is it to properly dispose of it? Thank you.
So, yes, if you use a carbon filter, that it does become hazardous waste and should be, you know, there should be a plan in place, either with the company that you had the filter installed with, to take back that carbon and properly dispose of it. So I'm not sure, Susan, if you wanted to add anything to that.
I do want to add something because I just saw another question that came up that I'm not seeing right now, but it's about carbon filtration, and a lot of people have it under their sinks for their kitchens. We too have a carbon filtration system in our garage where we have our whole water system. Our filtration system is to remove particulates in our well. It's not designed for PFAS. If you have PFAS in your well, you need a much more sophisticated carbon system than what you would routinely see. So I don't want anyone to leave this and think, oh, I already have a carbon filter, I'm fine. You're not. If you have PFAS, you need something very different. And yes, if it's designed for the collection of PFAS, Marie is right, it becomes hazardous waste. I don't know the cost of disposal. I know that's an issue though, and where is all this waste going to go is another issue.
Right.
Okay, so another question, I can read it and then Carol can comment if she wants to add to it. Is there any concern or risk that the plastic jugs that water comes in puts any PFAS into the bottled water? I'm thinking that Carol's probably referring to, you know, some households have been receiving bottled water on a regular basis through a program to help them because they've got a PFAS problem.
Right. So EPA has looked into the fluorination of plastic jugs containing food and water, and that does not appear to be an issue. It's really the chemical companies that are selling pesticides that are fluorinating the containers.
That's a relief.
Thank you. Yep.
That's a relief. Another one. Oh yeah, you just answered it in the chat too.
Yes, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be answering in the chat or not.
You're welcome to. So is POET filtration for all the water in a residence? Will a filtration system for drinking and cooking water be be sufficient? Chris asked that.
So it sort of depends on how much PFAS you have in your well. Drinking the water is the pathway where you will have the most significant exposure. PFAS compounds are very large molecules, and so they are not easily dermally absorbed, but I can't say that none of them will be dermally absorbed. You know, PFAS is an emerging contaminant, an emerging group of contaminants, and it kind of depends on the types of PFAS you have as well. So like PFOS and PFOA are very large. There's a lot of information on PFOS and PFOA. Those are not necessarily dermally absorbed, but some of the other shorter chained PFAS may be.
Okay. So Chris, I don't know if you wanted to comment. You've got several sort of related questions. Did you want to chime in?
No, that's okay. I was just sharing information, sort of my short-term response to mitigate our family's issue here. So,
okay. And this one's to Susan.
You got a hand raised.
Oh, I got a hand raised too. All right. We'll go to the hand raise, and that gives me a chance to look at the chat. Kirk.
Thanks, Rick. And thanks, Susan and Marie. This was really very, very helpful. I don't know if you're aware, we've been doing a lot of studying of PFAS in and around Lake Boone in Stow and Hudson. And I hope that we can connect and share some stories in the near future. But one question I had for you was, we did reach out indirectly to find out a little bit about what's been going on the investigation in the firefighting site, the Firefighting Academy in Stow, and its impact on Lake Boone. And DEP is conducting a study on that. Their consultant indicated that it was focused primarily on habitat suitability and habitat risks, because that's what DEP's really jurisdiction is here. And the question is, are you aware of any other state agencies that are focusing on the issues in Stow? We have a lot of potential sources. We have a lot of definitive sources in Stow. And when you look at a map of the state, we are on the high end of PFAS concentrations on average. Are you aware of any other state investigations or actions that could be helping us out?
Okay, Marie can probably add to this. A couple of years ago, legislation passed calling for a task force at the State House to evaluate PFAS concerns. And at about that time, Stow was identified as really one of the ground zero towns in the state. Some of you may have been at a very large meeting held in Stow. There were several hundred people where Mass DEP had a royal cast of characters, like the senior people in the state came to present to Stow, including the Board of Health. So I believe the State Board of Health is also involved in evaluating what's going on at Stow. I certainly am aware of the Firefighting Academy as being a source. That's a really big source. And they've used an awful lot of firefighting foam over many years, way before PFAS was identified as a problem in the foam. Mass DEP's jurisdiction is not just for protection of the environment. Even 21E is human health, safety, welfare. So 3 of the prongs are focusing on human exposures, and the 4th is the environment, and that's important too. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but I think Marie might have some of her own insights on this.
Yeah, I think both Mass DEP and Mass Department of Public Health are involved in that site. And DEP would be, as Susan said, involved in human health, public welfare, safety, and the environment. The person who you talked to might have just been working on the environmental part, but I'm sure they're looking at the human health there as well.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And I misspoke. I meant the State Department of Health. Our local Board of Health would also be concerned too.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So this question is for Susan. What is the current regulatory requirement related to disposing treatment media, granular activated carbon laden with PFAS? When is this waste likely to be designated as hazardous and require special disposal?
Wow, that one's for me, huh? Not Marie.
I can help answer that. It already is designated as hazardous. A lot of landfills won't take that. Most and no landfill in Massachusetts will take it. Again, if you have a POET system that is for that has been installed for treatment of PFAS, you have to work with the installer to, when they replace the activated carbon, they have to take that carbon and dispose of it properly, whether that's incineration, that's one of the ways that they're trying to get rid of it, or potentially landfilling it somewhere else. There's some other new technologies coming out. Cyclopure, which is a new technology that's out of Chicago, has a polymer that is specific for PFAS. There's some problems with using activated carbon because it's very non-specific, so it'll pull out your manganese and other iron and other things that are in your water, and so it can get fouled earlier if you have a lot of iron and manganese in there, as I do. I have a ton of iron and manganese in my well. And so you have to replace the activated carbon faster. And Cyclopure, their new technology is based on it's based on a cornstarch polymer, and it's specific for, they can create a certain size and it's specific for PFAS, and they can actually regenerate that polymer and reuse it over and over and over again. It's kind of an interesting technology, but it consolidates the PFAS so that there's a lot less PFAS waste. Interesting stuff. I'm hoping that it gets approved in Massachusetts soon.
Okay, we got two questions from two different people that relate to the golf course.
Okay.
So our well water has PFAS from Wedgwood Pines. Is anyone monitoring if they have changed their practices to eliminate the source of PFAS? And then a different person asked, for contamination in wells near golf courses or agricultural areas, which is the most likely source? PFAS contaminated pesticides or concentrated PFAS containing fertilizers, many formerly marketed as natural?
Right. So I'll take the second one first. It can be from either, it can be from the pesticides, or it can be from the the bio fertilizer. And, not all of that biofertilizer contains PFAS. You don't know until you test it. Not all of the pesticides contain PFAS. You don't know until you test it. So it could be from either, it could be from neither. You just, you could test the soil to see if the fertilizer, you could test the soil in the areas where you've used the fertilizer to see if there's PFAS there. PFAS at a higher than background concentration, because PFAS, there's a background concentration of PFAS in soil because it's so ubiquitous, it's actually in precipitation, and we're kind of getting it from everywhere. So hopefully that kind of answers that question. As for is anybody monitoring to see if they've changed their practices to eliminate their sources of PFAS? So Wedgwood Pines is now a listed site, which means it falls under the 21E regulations, and as part of those regulations, there's, the mitigation, which, is kind of the first part, right? Mitigate the exposure to the PFAS, right? Those are putting POET systems on the affected homes, right? Or giving you bottled water until a POET system can be installed. And then the next part of that is to, eliminate any potential sources if possible. And that might be remediating the soil, which kind of is not one of my sites. I know of it because I kind of keep track of what's going on in Stow. So I'm not exactly sure where they are in the process, but you can go onto the Massachusetts DEP website and see what's currently going on at the site. You can read any report that they submit. It's all online. It's all public record.
I just want to add a practical comment to your the first part of the question, which Marie just answered about practices at Wedgwood Pines. I would think the very, very best monitor of what the current practices are at Wedgwood Pines is the country club itself. They are in a big, expensive legal problem, environmental problem that they're strictly liable for without regard to fault. The last thing in the world they would ever want is to risk exacerbating the problem by their own practices. So I have a very high degree of confidence that whatever is going on now in terms of fertilizing and using pesticides is really carefully planned. So I'm not the least bit worried about them as an ongoing source, frankly. I mean, a new ongoing source.
It'll be interesting to see whether Mosquito Joe and similar companies talk about steps they're taking to remove PFAS, but that's a different topic.
Mm-hmm.
You got a couple here that are sort of related. I think we know the answer, but it might be good to clarify a couple of points. Tom asked, will a filtration system for drinking and cooking water be sufficient? And I say that I think we know the answer because that's what we're getting when, the state agrees to give us a bottle of water because our well has been contaminated. We're only getting it for drinking and cooking. What's your comments on that?
I think Marie addressed that to some extent, but that would be for you.
Yeah, I'm looking for the question so that I can read through it. Could you read the question again so that I want to make sure I'm answering correctly?
Will a filtration system for drinking and cooking water be sufficient? Okay.
So, ingestion of PFAS is the primary exposure pathway. That's what DEP and EPA are most concerned about at this moment. And the two most common PFAS compounds, PFOS and PFOA, because they are so large, generally they're not dermally absorbed in large concentrations, right? So I can't say that there's no dermal absorption whatsoever, but ingestion is the primary pathway that DEP and EPA are concerned about at this time. So there could be some dermal absorption. It's definitely much less than what you would be absorbing through oral ingestion.
So I think what Marie is saying is the risk of showering, the risk of washing your hands is pretty low. This is not like a volatile compound where it becomes airborne and a risk is inhalation. The risk here with PFAS is ingestion. And in fact, soil exposure is an ingestion risk. Do I have that right, Marie? That children will play in the dirt and
Put
pick
their
up
hands in their
something
mouth.
and put something in their mouth, or the dirt could be kicked up and they could actually ingest particles. So,
Right.
so I think the answer to the question is yes. If your source of drinking and cooking water is PFAS free, you should be fine.
Okay, so some of these questions may begin to sound similar, but they all have a slightly different twist to them. My drinking water has been contaminated from the nearby firefighting extinguishers. If the maximum goes to 4 parts per trillion, will the town and/or DEP, EPA pay for the house's POET system, as far as you know?
So if you are part of that source area, then they should be paying for your POET system. Yes.
Okay.
And that would then be triggered by the lower concentrations if adopted by either EPA, because DEP must respect a lower limit, or DEP's own limits. And I suspect if EPA's limit goes down and becomes more stringent, we'll see DEP react to that very, very quickly.
Right. A lot more houses in Stow are going to be affected when and if it goes down to 4 parts per trillion.
Thank you. This is Carol. I had asked that question. How will we know after December 31st if, in fact, the limit does go down to 4 PPT?
Well, it will be published online. I keep track of all of that stuff because it's my job. So I will know as soon as that comes out. You know, I don't know.
So when you say published online, do you mean like in a news article or something?
So it'll be published on the it'll be published on the EPA website first, and then Mass DEP will pick it up and also publish it on their website. I assume that it'll be huge news when this changes. So it'll also probably be picked up by various news organizations and stuff as well. But EPA has a website online, and you can go and look for, they have a page that's all about PFAS. DEP, Massachusetts DEP also has a website online. They have a page that's all PFAS. As soon as this information comes out, it'll be published in both of those places.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, I'm watching the time. I don't want to keep us all here all night, but there are a few more good points. Alan, you said you had a question a while ago. I don't know what that question is.
Yeah, I'm sorry I can't get my video to work tonight, but thank you, Marie and Susan, for this presentation. I just had 2 questions, sort of the beginning of the process and the end of the process. The beginning of the process, the question didn't get answered. How frequently should I test my water? Mine was tested not quite 4 years ago, and I was at 2 parts per trillion. So I know it's kind of around, and I want to test again at some interval here. What's the right interval and how to do that? Because it's expensive. The last time I did it, it was a few $100s. And today in the brand new Consumer Reports magazine that came out, they're pointing out that the costs of a PFAS test can go up to as much as $500. And that same magazine article talks about the CycloPure test that is a mail-in for $79, which could be a very economical way for people like me to keep testing more frequently than I would if it's going to be $500. So that's kind of a collection of questions about testing, frequency, and cost. Second part, at the back end, with respect to installing treatment systems, I don't think either of you mentioned that there is a bill pending in the state legislature. Our own representative, Kate Hogan, is a chief sponsor of this bill after coordinating a study committee at the legislature that went on, I think, for about 2 years. And that's a very comprehensive bill that includes many provisions, one of which I believe in the original form of the bill would set up some form of tax credits or rebates from the state for individuals like us who are trapped with contaminated water. So the question would be, would we be advisable to kind of wait a few months and see where this bill ends up if it gets passed, and whether there are in fact going to be state tax credits or rebates available for these things? We think there should be. So any comments you have about front end costs and back end costs?
You want to take the first question, Marie, and I'll take the second?
So the first question was like, how often should we test? So I actually looked this up today, and DEP's website says you can test once every 10 years.
Yeah, that's in my slides. That's what DEP says. I don't know if that's a good recommendation, though, as I pointed out, that my company says test every 2 years.
Right. I mean, I think testing every 2 years or to every 2 to 3 years is probably, if you have a non-detect level, or, I'd say below 10 or so. Of course, now that EPA might change it down to 4, now everybody's going to need a POET system. Most people, a lot of people will, I mean, so, the official recommendation is once every 10 years. I personally test my water for other things. Well, I test for bacteria twice a year, and I test for, for a while I tested for metals once a year until I decided that they're probably okay. And then I've dropped it down to once every 2 years. So PFAS might be in the once every 2 years.
What about
I test more than what's recommended.
What about that CycloPure $79 mail-in test?
So I've been in contact with CycloPure. It's interesting that you brought it up. I've been in contact with CycloPure for some of my sites recently. It's a new technology. It looks very promising for commercial properties. It hasn't been approved yet, but they're going through the Mass DEP approval process for mitigation of PFAS at contaminated waste sites. It looks like great technology. It's new technology, but that doesn't mean that it's bad technology. And, I think if they're offering to test water for $79 and they're getting, they said 54 PFAS compounds, that's a pretty robust number. That sounds very promising. I'd try it out.
Okay, a couple of others.
How about the back end costs? Should we be waiting to see what the legislature does?
Yeah, that was the question I'll take a shot at. I don't think so, Alan. We all know that bills can take a while to be passed, but if you want to test, go ahead and test. If you find PFAS in your well at unsafe levels and you want to wait to see what's happening with the legislature and whether there might be rebates, getting money from the state to pass a bill to help individuals can be a really tall order. But let's say we're lucky enough and it passes in a few months. Why not go on bottled water right away if you find something in your well? And then if it passes in a few months and you're eligible, take advantage of it then rather than install a treatment system now. But I did want to mention, you said that Kate Hogan has established this committee, and she's been sponsoring really great bills protecting of human health in the PFAS field. I saw a really good question come up in the chat by Tom Porcher, and that it's related. And Tom asked this question: is there a bill to eliminate sources? doesn't it seem only logical that when the country is spending literally trillions of dollars to try to address this, and many people are still drinking PFAS contaminated water and may not know it or may not be able to afford a PFAS elimination system, a POET system, doesn't it only make sense to get rid of the sources? Absolutely. I have been working with the LSP Association, as has Marie, on comments to federal legislation that would eliminate or urging that common PFAS sources be eliminated. Kate Hogan is doing the same thing. So it's my really strong hope we're going to get rid of this chemical so that it doesn't keep being released and create a worse problem than the one we already know about.
Different question, topic. Can you comment on the risks related to using GAC, granulated activated charcoal, for PFAS removal when there is also an elevated level of radon in the water?
They're separate issues, aren't they? I mean, I believe they're separate. I have radon in my well, and I have an air spinner, a very complex and quite expensive system to install and maintain in my for my whole water supply. I think that's a completely separate issue from carbon filters for PFAS, or even in my case, particulates, where I have a carbon filter. But I need to defer to Marie on that, but I do think they're separate.
Yeah, so it can complicate the removal of PFAS if you have radon in your water. And so a lot of times they actually have, if you're not removing your radon, they suggest you put an air stripper on first and then the PFAS system. It gets more complicated, so of course it increased the cost.
Okay, I'm scanning the remaining questions, and I know Mike's got his hand up. I'm going to take Mike's question, and if I have missed something that hasn't been covered that needs to be brought up, and by the way, do note that there are now, Marie's been putting in some links to various sites of.
Yeah, I'm trying to get to some of them and answer questions.
Okay, Mike, you're on.
Great, thank you. So getting back to the question of filters again. Filters can be tricky. I know this from applying them in a different situation, but in this case in water, what we're trying to do is remove these really tiny molecules at very, very small concentrations. So a number of things can possibly happen here. For example, a granulated activated charcoal filter works on the principle that there's a very high surface area. And I think, as someone mentioned, if there's manganese or something like that in the water, it could potentially impact the filter. I can think of other things that could potentially impact the efficacy of the filter. And then finally, we haven't answered the question yet, I don't think, of what does the filter cost, what does it cost to dispose of as a hazardous waste, and how do you know it's working? In other words, without testing, which, as Alan has pointed out, is a very expensive proposition, how do you know that it should be replaced or defective? Or you see the problem I'm trying to cite here. One of my concerns is we're talking about deploying a technology for filtration for a relatively new compound. And we don't have a lot of experience with that solution, if you know what I mean. We don't have a track record of, well, we have this many years of experience using granulated activated charcoal filters to remove PFAS, so we know how this all works really well over long term. Is that too much of a question, or is it a fair question?
Good question?
It's a good question, and I'll answer that, of course, there's some unknowns, right? But I will say we do have a lot of experience removing PFAS from the wells in the center of town, and the POET systems work great for that. The activated carbon has been working very well, and because the town is paying for it, we do test the water after the POET system is installed, and then we test several times after that. we're finding breakthrough when the PFAS is no longer picked up by the activated carbon and will go through about 2 years after the carbon is installed, after the POET system is installed. So they are working, and they're working very well for 2 years. It kind of depends on how much PFAS you have. If you have a higher concentration of PFAS, breakthrough will happen earlier. But we're finding about 2 years. So we start testing again at 1.5 years just to see, just to make sure we're capturing it, you know? And then a lot of people, so if you are not in an area that's been affected by, you know, one of the source areas, and you've got, you know, it's above 20, but less than, say, 70 or so, those are relatively low concentrations. So your activated carbon should last for, you know, quite a while, at least the 2 years.
Okay, I'm going to ask Elizabeth to comment. She's had several comments, sometimes questions, sometimes points of information. I wanted, you know, sort of as a last comment to our two experts here, and then we probably should let you go. Elizabeth, did you want to call out anything in your several comments in the chat, which look quite useful? And you may not be, you're probably on mute.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't figure out how to find the button. No, I thank Susan and Marie for the great presentations. There's so much stuff to consider when you find that you've got PFAS in your water. I mean, in so many cases, a lot of these wells are nowhere near a known source. You don't have any idea where it comes from. You know, I think what I think is really most important, and they've said this also, is that you really need to test, and you don't know if you know, you'll never know you have it unless you test. And the testing of knowing whether your filter is working, unfortunately, we haven't found an easy, like a substitute test to see if a GAC filter is working or not. Unfortunately, we still have to pay for the PFAS test to know if it's working, and you need to test it at least a few times before you suspect it's going to be running out.
Right.
Thank you.
And well, another thing that's a big concern is that, well, I know Stow has not shown very high levels of radon, but when you're installing GAC, radon absorbs to GAC.
Mm-hmm.
And I've worked in areas that have very high radon, and you know, within a year you could have dangerous levels of radioactivity on your tanks, and you just don't want that in your basement where your kids are playing and, you know, playing video games and stuff like that.
Right. So this is getting into radon exposure, which I also know a little bit about, being a toxicologist. Radon is one of those things that causes more of a health risk when you inhale it, right? So you can actually, if you have radon, I suggest you do a radon in air test. They're pretty cheap. You can get them at Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever, and put a system on your, like a depressurization system on your house, which I have actually. And it was, I installed it quite a while ago, but it was $1,000, I believe, to put in. It's not a big, heavy lift for radon mitigation. And then it can be in your water. It's less of an issue through ingestion, but again, it can volatilize in your shower, right? So if you have radon in your water, you can put a air stripper on before it gets to your GAC system. So it does increase the cost, but these are things that you can do.
Wow.
Iron and manganese, air strippers for radon.
I know it's complicated, but you know, so one way to look at it, because I work with a lot of water guys, right? If you were to live in, say, Brighton or Boston or anywhere where you have MWRA water, right, that's provided to you, that's actually pretty expensive water. You're paying a lot for that every month. And so we, in certain ways, pay less than that because we don't have a monthly bill, but you still have to pay for water because you have to make sure that your quality is good. You want to drink clean water. And so filtering your water and testing for it, that's kind of all part of your maintenance, and we just have wells instead of MWRA water, right? So, and when you filter it, it's very clean and doesn't have that chlorinated taste, right? So, so it's good water. It's just that now we have this PFAS issue. And, a lot of us have iron and manganese, there's also radon in some people's water, but if you're filtering it properly, you can still have clean water.
Thank you. I feel like I need to let you go. We continue to get new messages, and there's still some interesting comments that we haven't quite gotten to, but I want to sort of honor your time with us here tonight.
Yeah. So if there's questions that I haven't gotten to or Susan hasn't gotten to, Rick, is there a way that we can, you can send those to us and I can go through them later and maybe we can post them online or something?
Do we have your if you put your email address in the chat?
I'll do that.
Sure,
right now.
I can do that. So. Yeah, and you can send me a question directly too, if you didn't feel like putting something public on the chat.
And same here, absolutely.
That's wonderful. I really want to thank you for your presentation and for your gift of time putting this together and talking to us. This is such a complex subject. It's just so great to have two local experts right here to talk with. Thank you.
Thank you for having us and for arranging this, Rick.
Oh, happy to do so.
Good, important presentations for Stow.
It is.
Very.
Tina, did you have any closing comments you wanted to make?
No, I mean, this was amazing. I feel like this is the most engaged conversation we've had in quite a while. So clearly it's important. I mean, I know it affects the library, so it was very interesting. And I thank you all. It's great.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank
Good night,
you.
everybody.
Thank
Good
you. Good night.
Night.